Welcome everyone to Catalista's 2 Minutes to Midnight. People get ready. My name is Henry Coleman, coming to you from the studios at Catalista Centrale. "2M2M" is a deep dive into how the world works. In Season 1, we explore a book that connects the dots between accelerating computing power, capitalism, and democracy. It's called People Get Ready: The Fight Against a Jobless Economy and a Citizenless Democracy by Robert McChesney and John Nichols. On this episode, we're starting on Chapter 2, A Jobless Economy. We're going to define capitalism and take a good hard look at employment and unemployment, workers' rights and automation. We're going to be hearing from 7 different guests on this episode, and they all have a lot to say. In the mainstream media, we're presented with a picture of employment that's shockingly rosy. We're basically told there's more jobs than ever. But this doesn't exactly match people's lived realities. We need to rethink this mainstream narrative to really understand how corporate power and technology is threatening people's financial security and making people work harder just to get by. It's a crucial and compelling story. Let's begin with Nancy Fraser, who is a professor of philosophy and politics at the New School for Social Research in New York City. She works on social, political, and feminist theory. Her essays have been collected in the book Unruly Practices, and her latest book is Cannibal Capitalism. Nancy, let's set the stage for this episode. What is neoliberal capitalism, and how's it been working for people over the past 5 decades?
Let me start by saying what I think capitalism is in order to get to neoliberal capitalism, because I have a somewhat, let's say, non-orthodox view of what capitalism is. Most people think capitalism is an economic system. It's the place where commodities are produced, where profit is accumulated, where workers are exploited, et cetera, et cetera. But for me, that's only a small part of the story. I want to propose instead what I call an expanded view of capitalism, which really focuses on the relationship between the economic system and its background conditions of possibility. All of the non-economic zones, the non-economic activities, social relations, and forms of wealth in society that are absolutely necessary supports for those things I just mentioned, for commodity production, profit accumulation, exchange, and distribution, et cetera, et cetera. And I just want to mention very quickly 4 of these essential background conditions for a capitalist economy. First is a large fund of often unwaged labor of care and social reproduction, the work of families, of communities, especially of women, that essentially produce, reproduce, and sustain the human beings who are the workers, are the capitalists, et cetera, et cetera. If you didn't have this background sphere of social reproduction, you couldn't have economic production. The second is a sizable fund of what I would call expropriated or stolen wealth from racialized populations who are not simply exploited, but expropriated, meaning their wealth, their land, their labor, their energies, and so on, has historically and in the present actually just been seized for the benefit of capital, not in the kinds of legal forms that the exploitation of free workers occurs. That's a necessary background condition, not just at the start of the system, as theorists like Marx would have said, but on an ongoing basis. There's a constant siphoning of wealth from the global south, sometimes through debt and through outright corporate invasion of fishing grounds or rainforests, et cetera, et cetera. And essentially, this distinction between exploited free labor and expropriated dependent or unfree labor That corresponds to the global color line. It's a huge part of the story of why capitalism has this racial dimension. Anyway, that's the second necessary condition. The third are the quote unquote free, or if not totally free, at least cheap gifts of nature. The forms of energy, the raw materials, the whole material substratum of production, as well as the general environmental conditions like a habitable planet, breathable air, arable land, drinkable water, carbon sinks, et cetera, et cetera. Without that, you couldn't have a viable capitalist economy. And the last thing are a whole set of public goods supplied by states and other public powers. So, infrastructure, a stable money supply, a legal system that underpins private property, repressive police or military forces to keep order. All of those things are also essential to capitalism. So, an expanded view of capitalism includes not only the economy, but these background conditions needed to support it. And the value of this way of understanding capitalism is that allows us to pose the question, what is the relation between the economy and its background conditions? And my answer to that question is that this is, in general, a contradictory and perverse relationship, because in every case, the economic actors who are, or the powerful ones, who are bent on accumulating profits, on keeping their share prices up, and so on and so forth, those folks are incentivized by this system to help themselves freely, or as close to freely as possible, to what they want in the way of background conditions, with zero obligation to replenish what they take or to repair what they damage. So they are incentivized to guzzle up care work and pay as little as possible, to scarf up nature and leave a trail of environmental wreckage everywhere, to help themselves to the public goods supplied by states at the same time as they are evading taxes, trying to weaken regulations, and you see the contradictory character, to help themselves to the expropriated wealth of racialized people without replenishing that. So in every case, this is a contradictory and potentially destructive and potentially crisis-prone system. Now we get to neoliberal capitalism. I know I'm going the long way around, but I think I need to do this to tell you my view about this. In any form of capitalism, you're going to have these contradictory impulses, these potential for things going very badly. But some forms of capitalism have tried to diffuse or restrain or finesse these contradictions, to put some restraints on capital, on corporations, to force them to pay more taxes. Some states have tried to supply public support for social reproduction in education, healthcare, parental leave, childcare, elder care. The idea of a welfare state is one way of addressing that. The thing is, in neoliberal capitalism, all of those restraints and hedges have been lifted. It's a form of capitalism that really gives the profiteers full permission, in effect, to just behave in the most predatory and destructive way, to cannibalize the background conditions for the economy. And that's why I think we're in the mess that we're in. You've asked what condition has neoliberal capitalism left for us? Well, I think it's pretty clear from what I just said. It's left us with an acute ecological crisis, with a severe care crunch, which has been rendered especially visible under conditions of pandemic, how this unwaged work of social reproduction is crucial. It's left us cannibalizing the wealth of racialized people. And this is part of, I think, what the slogan Black Lives Matter is meant to call attention to. the way in which there are these extra disproportionate burdens placed on people of color. For example, much lower rates of home ownership. That's one form that this expropriation of wealth has taken. And political crisis. In an acute political crisis of governance, where corporations can easily evade regulations on climate, on labor, on whatever. And another side of the political crisis is what I would call a crisis of hegemony, meaning that many, many people experiencing all the dysfunctions, the irrationality, the injustices of this system have begun to defect, have withdrawn their support or at least acquiescence from the mainstream political parties, from the mainstream official common sense of the society. They are looking for alternatives. In some cases, they're gravitating to very bad alternatives. In other cases, to better. But we've got a multidimensional crisis of economy, ecology, care, racial antagonism, and of politics. That's what neoliberalism has brought us, and it's not an accident. It was kind of built in to this form of capitalism and in another sense to capitalism in general when left unrestrained.
So, if the economy remains on this path, what might the future of wages and job conditions look like? And what would all this mean for societies that consider themselves to be democratic?
It's very hard to even imagine neoliberalism actually just continuing. I mean, one thing that it is leading to is ecological catastrophe. I think if we don't figure out how to disarm the forces that are opposing a transformation of our whole energy system, if we don't get a handle on the carbon emissions and of the fossil fuel companies and the other entrenched interests that are determined to, protect that, then we're just going to have wildfires raging, rising seas, horrendous floods and tsunamis and hurricanes. And I mean, this ecological global warming and tropical deforestation, which have been caused by this untrammeled capitalist development. On the ecological front and the public health front, we're in for a very, very rough ride. And because, as I said, neoliberalism has weakened state capacities, it's deprived us of the public agencies, the public capacities that we might have used to get a handle on COVID or on ecological. I mean, the balance of power between corporations and states has shifted heavily in favor of corporations, investors, banks, and so on. So I would paint a very dark scenario, and that's over and above the sorts of things that you're mentioning about wages and so on. I mean, there's also, just to address that more specifically, there's also been a big shift in the balance of power between capital and workers, and not just paid workers, but the working classes broadly conceived to include caregivers and precariously employed people and unemployed and semi-employed people and so on. This neoliberal form of capitalism essentially weakened, if not wholly destroyed, labor unions. It drove down wages in, at least from where they were, in the sort of advanced sectors of the capitalist world. And so doing has made it necessary for households to contribute many more hours of waged work than they had to in the New Deal era, let's say, in order to support the household. And that means it's demanded a heavy contribution in time of people who had been primary caregivers and who still are. So neoliberalism, at the same time, disinvests public support for social reproduction and also diverts the energies of communities and families to contribute to social reproduction by diverting their energy into paid work. So that's another little perfect storm. You see, what I'm trying to say here is that it's a mistake to look only at the official economic side of this, that the destructive path that neoliberalism has set us on is equally troubling with respect to these quote unquote non-economic zones of social reproduction, state power, public health, and environment, and so on. So I feel we're at a very acute pitch of crisis. And I feel that unless something gives, that we continue on that path, except something's got to give. People are not going to just stay on that path. And that's why we're getting this turn to authoritarianism, to electing political strongmen who have no solutions to these problems, but play on people's fears, their legitimate grievances, however badly interpreted those grievances are. So I think we're in for an extremely rough ride. And I think that behooves all of us to put aside the usual way of thinking about capitalism and politics, which inclines us to piecemeal reforms within the system. I think we need to put that aside in favor of a much more radical perspective that contemplates real restructuring, some deep structural changes in the whole social order.
Andy Merrifield is a scholar and author of a dozen books and numerous articles, essays, and reviews, found in publications like The Nation, Harper's Magazine, and Jacobin. His doctorate is in human geography from the University of Oxford, and he teaches urbanism, social theory, and literature. His latest book is Marx, Dead and Alive: Reading Capital in Precarious Times. Andy, we don't hear the term proletariat a lot these days, but we do hear precariat a bit more, especially to refer to jobs like driving Ubers and other jobs with little or no protections. Is the precariat an accurate term for a lot of the workers in today's global economy?
I just wrote a book on Karl Marx. It was about Volume 1 of Capital, essentially, a dialogue with it. My subtitle was Reading Capital, as in Marx's Capital, in Precarious Times. But what is amazing about Marx's Capital, many things are amazing about it, but one thing that I hadn't thought about before is Marx really theorizes all work, all jobs under capitalism as being precarious. The precarity is the condition of work under capitalism. The capitalism, we know from the manifesto, as it develops materially, as it develops the world market, as globalization, as we call it, has taken a hold over the last 30 years, it's done things to people's livelihoods. It's, as Marx said, it's pretty much nestled everywhere, settled everywhere, and converted people's value into what he called naked cash interest, into exchange values. Some of the language in the Communist Manifesto talks about stripping away halos, converting people who thought they had hallowed jobs, such as doctors, lawyers, even priests, that when they feel the force of the market and the vicissitudes of the kind of supply and demand for labor and the vicissitudes of the business cycle, and when they feel sort of technological innovations come into the bargain, then they feel this brunt force as a way in which they're in somehow being desanctified. So in a sense, all labor, Marx suggests, under capitalism is precarious. It always has been, and it always will be. And to maybe just identify a group of perhaps the most precarious as having a label that seems to almost separate them from what we might see as the normal working class, because we can talk about a working class. And the fact is, it doesn't look as if they have lots of things in common with workers that may be white-collar workers that seem to have quite privileged conditions, but actually the stability, the security, the benefits that they have are very, very fragile indeed. So the fragility perhaps isn't quite as fragile, isn't as precarious, but they have lots more in common than you may think. And I think if you start calling somebody the precariat and you're working as a clerk in a bank or in some high-tech industry somewhere, that you feel like they're not talking about me. They're talking about them who live elsewhere, live far from me, and their lifestyle is very different. So I suppose in terms of thinking as a Marxist, it rather than perhaps inspiring a kind of class consciousness, it seems to create forms of separation within the working classes. It creates fragmentation where one would hope that organizing could show that workers of white, blue, no color do have certain things in common that they share because they belong to a class of people that feel the wrath of the ruling classes. It probably is easier to identify a ruling class than it is to identify a working class. Some of the most precarious workers in the Midwest or in Arkansas or Montana or various places such as that, they're gung-ho Donald Trump people, and they don't want anybody taking away their freedom. They've sort of bought the idea that they're going to take their chances and this system can benefit them if they just work harder. And any failure is a kind of personal failing rather than seeing as some form of structural constraints that are out there. So it's a very complicated scenario. Yes, I think it does explain the world of work today, with the caveat that I'm not terribly fond of it because I think it creates a certain form of fragmentation and obfuscation when perhaps there's things in common with working people, that these commonalities could be identified. And it's how one could do that becomes the issue for any kind of progressive politics.
And I'll ask you to take that trend and look into the future. Where are we heading with capitalism and the precarious nature of work?
So I think that precarious nature of work is likely to increase more and more. If you strip away benefits and you strip away unions and you abandon all kinds of regulatory frameworks, you can have a free rein of disciplining working class people. And then you have new technology that comes in and it can, reduce wages. If you think about, could work be made less precarious? Well, possibly, yes. If you think of even people working for Amazon, they're running around like crazy in the warehouses. The guys driving the trucks, driving like rapid speeds to make the deadlines and to deliver the goods when they say so. There's a tremendous amount of stress involved and long hours. And we know all about the working conditions and some of the sort of injuries that have incurred at Amazon. But, Jeff Bezos and the profits of Amazon are so huge that, you could almost kind of slash them in half and pay those workers triple what they earn, employ another third of a workforce, much more of a workforce, pay them some great wage, have some kind of job sharing going on. And they could probably feel quite good about what they're doing because I'm often quite thrilled when I get a book and Amazon delivery through the mail. And I'm quite thankful of the guys who are delivering these things. And I do use Amazon. And I just think that a lot of people would really see these guys are kind of heroes in a sense, doing all these things and getting this delivered. If only they were paid properly, if only there were more employees working for them, if only the profits could be recycled and then invested in maybe using the monies to the Amazon pay some real taxes and you could reinvest those in creating some other kind of jobs and infrastructure. There's that way in which somehow even the world of capitalist work can be made, reformist. You could reform it to actually make it better. And you could still have a form of quite healthy capitalism, I guess. That's, kind of one scenario that you could envisage.
David Van Dusen is a longtime libertarian socialist thinker, organizer, and militant union leader. He served 2 terms as president of the AFL-CIO, the Vermont Labor Union. He has also been a member of Democratic Socialists of America and Anti-Racist Action and the Green Mountain Anarchist Collective. David, what are your thoughts on the precarious nature of employment these days?
Well, when we talk about precarious workers, right, we're talking about the gig economy. We're talking about the modern neoliberal notion that you don't have, according to labor law, an employer, that you are falsely designated as your own employer when all of your work happens to be for Uber or whoever it may be, or a tech company. To be absolutely candid, it's bullshit. It's a way to weaken labor. It's a way to weaken solidarity. It's a way to say we don't have collective bargaining anymore in this country. And as more and more manufacturing becomes automated with machines and robots, more and more folks are working in precarious fields. So the capitalist class knows what they're doing. They're trying every means they can through hook or by crook and by law to try to divide working people and try to create barriers for organizing and for class solidarity. We need to resist this. We need to fight back.
Mark E. Thomas is the author of 99%, Mass Impoverishment and How We Can End It, and he founded the 99% organization. Applying the tools of business strategy to understand the stability of countries, he concluded that current economic policies will result in the unwinding of civilization before the year 2050, a fate that he says can be avoided. Mark, we actually get given a pretty rosy picture of employment these days. Unemployment's low, there's jobs to go around, etc. Are employment trends in the US, the UK, and the world actually as positive as we hear in the mainstream media?
I don't think they are quite as rosy as we normally hear. There are two different things going on there. There are some very short-term trends to do with the economy bouncing back after COVID. Those are genuinely positive in most countries. But there's a longer-term trend which isn't fully picked up in the data. And the reason for that is, if you look at the definition of unemployment, most countries use the International Labour Organization definition of unemployment, which sounds perfectly reasonable. You take the percentage of the labour force which is in employment, and that gives you your employment rate. But both the definition of labour force and the definition of employment don't necessarily reflect today's reality. So the labour force includes people who are of working age, available to work, and seeking work. So if somebody has become discouraged from the workforce, they no longer count as part of that potential labour force. So that has one effect. Probably an even bigger issue, though, is the definition of being employed, which basically means if you're employed at all, you're employed. So if you work for 1 hour a week, you're employed in that week. You're not unemployed in that week. So somebody who is on an insecure 0 hours contract and maybe picks up a couple of hours a week stacking shelves at Walmart or something counts as employed, not unemployed. So I suspect that when the definitions were created, most jobs were what you might think of as a proper job, that it would be a 40-hour week and you knew what you were getting paid and you knew when you were expected to be there. And so that definition would work reasonably well as a measure of employment. But now that we have a huge gig economy, I think it doesn't capture things properly. And so, as your question asked, I think it presents an unduly rosy picture.
Do you think the United States government hides the real numbers of the unemployed? Do other countries do that? And if so, how do they do it?
Well, whether to call it hiding is a good question, because I think it's a sin of omission rather than commission. I think what has happened is a failure to update the measures to reflect today's reality rather than a conscious twisting of it. But the truth is that the real story is that although we have had an increase in the number of jobs according to that definition, we've actually had a decline in proper jobs. So the true story is almost the opposite of the headline figures that we get from that traditional definition of unemployment. So if you think back to the 1950s, it was very common for a single breadwinner to be able to support a family on that one income. Whereas now, it takes two full-time incomes, and even then it's a struggle. So that means there's been a dramatic decline, actually, in the quality of life. If you go back a long time, in the 1800s in the UK, just about half of all jobs were being done by children. When we didn't have that single breadwinner model, then we moved towards a single breadwinner model. And, by the Second World War, that worked, that a single breadwinner could support the whole family. There were some downsides because it probably reinforced sexist stereotypes and so on. But actually, it meant families had an enormous amount of flexibility. They had time to spend as families. There were all sorts of benefits to being able to support a family on a single income. Now we are in a position where many families struggle with two incomes and maybe even both partners having to have multiple jobs because they're not proper jobs, they're these gig economy jobs. So the stresses and strains just simply in terms of being able to put the food on the children's plate and to heat the houses, they are far, far greater than they were after the Second World War. So I think the long-term trend is subtly but very importantly different from the picture that you would get if you just look at the official statistics. So we looked in the UK and we found that the number of jobs absolutely has been rising, but if you try to estimate the number of proper jobs, that's been on a decline for quite some time. And that's the real story. That's the underlying reality that affects people's lives, I think.
And one last one for you, Mark, and it might kind of sound like a basic one. The assumption is that it is important for a society to strive for full employment. Is that definitely the case?
Well, I think it is, especially if we're in anything like our current system. If you were to imagine completely different systems, you might be able to create an attractive world where it wasn't important to be employed. But in our system, where effectively the way that most people get money is by working for it, then it's very important. And I think full employment should mean that anybody who is willing and able to work can get a job. That's clearly good for those individuals. First of all, they want it by definition. Secondly, it is a way of getting money. Thirdly, it means that they are actively producing valuable products and services for the rest of the population. But thirdly, if you have full employment, that does shift the bargaining power a bit. You may have heard people talk about this idea of a reserve army of the unemployed. If that exists, if there's a huge buffer of unemployed people waiting to fill every job, then employers know that they can fire half a dozen people because they don't like the color of their hair or something, because they can just go and hire another half dozen straight away. If there is no stock of unemployed people, employers have to be much more careful. And that starts to shift the bargaining power and is likely to result in a slightly fairer sharing of the pie. So both for personal reason and for social reasons, if we're in anything like our current system, I think full employment should be the aim.
John Bellamy Foster is the editor of the Monthly Review and professor of sociology at the University of Oregon. He's authored and co-authored many books, including Marx's Ecology, The Ecological Rift, Capitalism's War on the Earth, and The Theory of Monopoly Capitalism. His research focuses on the political and ecological contradictions of capitalism and imperialism. John, let's address this notion of labor market polarization. In People Get Ready, labor market polarization is described as a relatively small number of great jobs for those at the top, lots of crappy jobs for those at the bottom, and fewer jobs in between. What causes labor market polarization? Is this a US phenomenon or is it happening worldwide?
Well, it's happening worldwide, and it's been happening for a long time, although it's getting worse in some respects and technology has changed. But basically, if you look at it from the standpoint of the sociologist or even an economist, this tendency goes way back. If you look at various thinkers across the spectrum, Adam Smith, Charles Babbage, who was a managerial theorist and invented the first computer, and Karl Marx, all from the early days of capitalism, they all described a process in capitalism whereby profits are made, accumulation occurs through a division of labor, and the central aspect of the division of labor in the capitalist system is reducing labor input. That's crucial for making profits. To reduce the unit labor costs per item of production and to reduce the labor input in general, there's a systematic tendency in capitalism, in a modern market system, if you prefer to call it that, to reduce labor input and labor costs. And part of this goes along with tendencies that were described from the very beginning of capitalism and also by more 20th century thinkers like Frederick Winslow Taylor and Harry Braverman, representing different sides of the political spectrum, where it was understood that to make profits, you basically had to degrade labor or we call it de-skilling, reduce the skill component in labor, in the labor input. So any kind of skill demands a wage premium. And the more skilled you are, the more control you have over production. The system is geared to reducing the control over production of workers and reducing their wages, their power, and concentrating the conception of production and the rules over its execution at the very top within management, and making workers the appendage of a machine, or having workers do simpler and simpler tasks. And that's really the tendency in our whole system. And it's actually been accelerated with digitalization and expanded automation. So although we've got smart machines, as we call them, people are actually doing dumber and dumber jobs, or more and more degraded jobs. People are treated as mere cogs in the whole machinery and labor is being replaced by automation. This won't ever be complete because as you throw people out of work, the old reserve army of labor principle, as unemployment goes up, wages go down, labor becomes cheaper, and then can compete to some extent with automation. And then there are areas where automation doesn't really apply. So always there will be demands for labor, but more and more we're seeing a situation where people are being replaced by machines, being de-skilled, where digital technology is used for surveillance to discipline workers at higher and higher levels. And so most people now work at jobs where they don't really need much in the way of education or training to do the jobs. They're simply replaceable by almost anybody else, maybe with a few days training. And that's really the definition of unskilled labor. And unskilled labor is becoming more pervasive in our society. Now, some people go to universities and enter the professional managerial class, and they've got relatively privileged jobs. Not that the jobs are necessarily all that creative, but they're on the managerial side. They may have more flexibility in their work, and they maybe are on the side of disciplining or surveilling labor. And so those jobs seem to be higher quality, but they're also alienated and degraded in their own way. And this is the direction our society is going. Education becomes less important where jobs are degraded and de-skilled because people don't really have to know very much to carry out their jobs. And we could give hundreds of examples. The most obvious example now is people who used to drive cars or trucks as part of their work. They're being replaced by automation as well. So we're seeing this across the society. And it's a society that's not really geared to the needs of human beings. It's geared to profits. And the profits are made by degrading jobs, by disciplining workers, by increasing the power of capital relative to workers. And that's simply the way it works. What we're told is, well, as productivity goes up, you will have jobs that are more creative. You'll work shorter hours. You'll get more pay, but none of those things actually come about. And of course, there's vast amounts of underemployment in our society that keep wages down and that this whole system perpetuates. And jobs are continually degraded because there's no end to the goal of accumulation of profits at the top. And no matter how much wealth is concentrated at the top, the process continues. A couple of years ago, I could say that three people, actually three white men, probably everybody knows who they are, have more wealth than half of the U.S. population. But probably now, 2 years later, I haven't looked. The numbers are even more unequal. And that's the way things are going. It's reflected in our working lives. And ultimately, it's a question of power. It's a question of what all our production is for, what our jobs for. what is work for in this society. And if it's mainly about promoting profits, this is the way it works, because profits are promoted primarily by reducing labor costs, unit labor costs. And that's also the reason why there's so much outsourcing to production in the global south, because you get lower unit labor costs there. So jobs are exported and automation replaces jobs. Where the jobs can't be exported, the increased surveillance through digital means is used to discipline workers more and to create crappier jobs, because there are a lot of jobs where if you move your eyeballs away from the computer for a second, that's recorded. That level of control is beyond anything we've ever seen in the history of humanity. And that creates not only crappy jobs, that creates a kind of slavery at work.
Jose Laluz is an organizer and labor educator with 5 decades of experience in the American labor movement. Jose got his start as a member of the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, and he participated in the founding of Democratic Socialists of America. He's currently organizing outreach to Latinx communities in Florida and Texas. Jose, in the United States, unions have been decimated over the past 60 years. What would it take for unions around the world to reassert their strength and advance real democracy?
It goes back to the question of building power. A good example of this in France, the union density is very low. It's perhaps as low as what it is here in America, maybe 10, 12% of the workforce. But workers in France are able to exercise immensely more power because they have the ability to mobilize themselves, to occupy the streets whenever there are fundamental challenges to the gains that they have achieved as a class, not only in terms of wages and social insurance and social gains, but also the very question of political power. There are political parties in France that are very closely aligned with the workers' movement, with trade unions and other working class organizations. We do not have anything that comes even close to that in our country. I mean, some people claim that the Democratic Party is, in fact, the party of the working class because a lot of working people ask their ballots for Democratic candidates. But it is also a fact that it has been many Democratic presidents, to name one, Bill Clinton, that have introduced these neoliberal economic policies that have resulted in the decimation of unions. So there is a need to address this question of power, and workers have to demand as a fundamental demand, as a fundamental right, that their allies, the people that they have helped to elect, in this case Democrats, who claim to be friends of workers, live up to their promise and actually enact legislation that would make it possible for unions to grow, for workers' bargaining power to grow, and for workers to be able to defend their hard-won gains that cost them many lives in the previous decade.
David, back to you. Do you think labor unions are up for the task of bringing about meaningful change and reviving democracy? Do workers stand a chance of being listened to in this day and age?
When the labor laws no longer serve our needs, we need to ignore them. We need to organize beyond them. And we have to do whatever it takes to win a real gains for working class people as a whole. Now, let's not forget that labor laws were many were written coming out of the 1930s, which was a period of incredible activity among the working class. There were fears of a revolution in this country and many others. And those labor laws were written as a way to cede power to working people, to give unions something to chew on in order to divert the energy that at that time was leading towards a revolution. But the capitalist class forgot why they crafted those laws to begin with. They are rolling them back. Their own greed is making them short-sighted. And now we're coming into an era once again, like during the Great Depression, when the laws themselves do not protect us and we have to learn to fight against the laws and work around the laws and work beyond the laws. If we want to see where labor has won some huge victories over the last 5, 10 years. Look no further in West Virginia. Look no further to the teachers there who essentially did wildcat strikes. And it wasn't just there. We're talking about Oklahoma and states all around this country. And they won real gains. Those strikes were illegal. They were not allowed by the current labor laws, yet they did them anyway. And because they were unified, because they weren't afraid to take action, because the bureaucracy did not scare them into doing nothing, they won. So I say this because the limitation that we place on ourselves is the greatest foil we have to building a working class union movement in this country, which is capable of overcoming the challenges of liberalism. But we have to get away from the idea that we only have a narrow field to play in and that field is defined by the capitalist class. We have to make our unions democratic. Some unions are democratic and some radically so. Many unions, the AFL-CIO as a federation of unions, is not democratic. It's not nearly as democratic as it needs to be. There's weighted voting. There's very little room for participatory democracy. What we need to do is we have to have a movement within labor to democratize our own labor movement, to give the rank and file a true vote and a true voice when it comes to making serious decisions for the working class. And further, beyond that, we need to fight like hell to create a labor movement which is not only focused on its narrow self-interest. We still need to do our bread and butter stuff, and we need to do it well. But we also need to be looking more in a transformative direction whereby labor becomes the pole and the voice for a different type of society, one where working people have true Social Security, where they have the ability to support their families, where they don't live in precarious economic state at all times. If we become that pole, and if we dedicate ourselves to fighting for social justice in alliance with those organizations like Black Lives Matter, like migrant justice, then our power will be amplified tenfold. But we need to become that voice and that pole, because I'll tell you what, working class people, they know that the Democratic Party, by and large, does not stand with them. And as long as we hitch our wagon over and over again to the Democratic Party and put our eggs in that basket, and when working people see them sell us out time and time again, right, then working people are going to tune out to the political process that we ask them to engage in. And what happens when they do that? They turn to neo-fascism. They turn to an alternative. They turn to Donald Trump. We need to present a real alternative to working class people, and not one presented by the right, but one presented by the left. If we do all of those things, and if we take the millions of dollars we put into elections, putting Democrats into office, and we put that into organizing, that's how we're going to build power within the labor movement.
Nozomi Hayase is a depth psychologist dedicated to the empowerment of people. She's also a journalist who applies a psychological lens to social and political issues. Nozomi covers issues of free speech and government transparency, including the vital role of whistleblowers and decentralization. Nozomi, what is your take on automation? It affects our jobs and our economy, but how? And might it even affect us as human beings at deeper levels as well?
So in regards to automation, as I see it, it's a part of transhumanism agenda. And for those of you who are not familiar with the agenda of transhumanism, it is the kind of philosophy that has been developed over the last 30 years. And its aim is to basically create post-human society. And the larger vision is a depopulation and also alter fundamentally what it means to be human. That their idea is to go beyond biological limitations through use of technology and science. So I see automation certainly is the larger part of this transhumanism agendas. And so I think those in power who are behind this transhumanism agendas, that they do not really care about ordinary people. They don't value what makes us human, basically. So they are willing to, I think, replace human labor with robot. So I don't think that elite who have been constructing our social and economic system have any plans to replace those displaced workers, that they are probably happy to see them just to starve to death and be wiped out from our existing economic activities. I don't think that there would be any kind of replacement for these workers who are dispossessed. Certainly, this is not something that political leaders and corporations have in mind. And so that's why I think it's important for people to look ahead and see what's coming and to fight back to create economy that really serve for human values. For that, I think we need to start asking ourselves a question of what it means to be human.
Pegasus is an example of a surveillance software that's been used to target activists, journalists, and politicians, intercepting everything on their phones, including photos, emails, and chats. It's a good example of what technology means in the hands of the 0.1%. John, what types of structures, education, and media might support technology that serves people and planet rather than the 0.1%?
Well, if you look back into the 1990s, which isn't that long ago, the internet was being established. The World Wide Web, as it was called then, was being established. And you had all these people like Bill Gates wrote a book, I forget the title, it was all about friction-free capitalism. The promise was that digital technology was going to provide all these free goods and free connections and a kind of liberty and equality the world had never seen. And it would enhance creativity, that it would destroy monopolies. These were the arguments. I argued against that at the time, as did Bob McChesney, who is one of the authors of People Get Ready. And what did we get? Those original dreams were in some ways realistic, because this technology gives us so many possibilities in terms of creativity, quality, finding out what people's needs are and fulfilling them. There are so many aspects to digital technology in that respect. But the problem was it was immediately captured by capitalism. The internet wasn't actually created by the market. It was created by the Pentagon, but it became marketized very quickly, and it was captured by capital. At first, there were all sorts of arguments. Well, no one couldn't control the internet. There couldn't be monopolies, wouldn't be able to profit off of it, and so on. But they quickly found ways via Google, via surveillance capitalism. The term surveillance capitalism is a concept that Robert McChesney and I came up with in 2014, and we talked about surveillance capitalism and how this had merged via marketing and the military in other ways and through finance. It was later taken over by Shoshana Zuboff and used in a narrower sense. But this whole system became a system of surveillance rather than the internet, rather than providing freedom and opportunity and equality, ended up being a mechanism for surveillance and control and profit making. And the biggest monopolies that we've ever seen in the history of the earth, and promoting financialization. But it's important to remember those original kind of utopian conceptions of, what we could do with this technology. We could do all sorts of things with this technology. The problem is our social institutions that put it in the power of a very few people what is really a public good and something that should belong to everyone. It isn't the technology, it's the privatization. And now we have things like Pegasus, which is a form of spyware. It's promoted by a private company. We're also presented with the view that only the government that we should worry about in terms of this technology and surveillance. And that's nonsense. Private corporations are involved in all kinds of surveillance, and now there's this intrusive spyware that nobody can really control. It can get on your devices, and unless the private sector is somehow reined in by the public sector, there's no way of controlling this. But the problem, of course, of the public sector is that it's largely controlled by private capital. So what do we need for this technology to be controlled, to be used properly? We need something called democracy. And we don't have it. We may think we have it, but we don't. Not in a practical level anymore. It's been removed. But we have to reestablish that. if we're going to be able to regulate or transform this system. Now, this isn't going to happen with a corporate system. It's going to only happen if people get ready and act. And it requires a great development of democracy, all of a sudden, a reinvigoration of democracy, which I think that if people realize how great the dangers are at this point, it's possible. People are like volcanoes. They can explode when you least expect it. In human history, there have been great movements at times, I guess, resembling this time, although the issues are much greater now. So things can change, but right now we have the technology is under the control of a relatively small part of the tiny part of the population, which also controls finance and capital and largely controls the state, even in the United States. We don't have to look to dictatorships to see countries where spyware is being used or where surveillance is activated on the whole population. The United States invented it. And in terms of surveillance capitalism, began here, and it's most developed here. So we have a lot of things to fight over if we want to retain any kind of democracy and equality. We have to fight for it. We have to recreate it. And even for human survival, we have to struggle at this point. And I don't think the spyware is dangerous for social movements because it can be used by the police, by private interests in ways to repress social movements. But nothing can really repress the population as a whole once there's a great revolt from below, as in the 1930s. So that's where we have to place our hopes in our organization and so on. And spyware won't work if the movement is big enough.
Nozomi, what is your take on Pegasus and the bigger picture tech landscape that's currently unfolding?
So the Pegasus spyware scandal that came out is just an indication of centralization of the internet that has been happening in recent years. So I think what is important is most people think that the internet has become synonymous with Google, Facebook, all those kind of companies that provide a platform for social medias or data search engine, for instance. But underlying infrastructure of the internet that run these central servers of those corporations had been already compromised. And in fact, the WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange is someone who became aware of this and alerted public long before the Edward Snowden's revelations of NSA mass spying. And Julian Assange said the internet has become a great threat to human civilization. And I think it's important for us, ordinary people, to recognize the internet is a tool that could be used to enslave humanity or to liberate, emancipate humanity. So that the question is how we can take back our democratic control over the internet. How can ordinary people claim the internet as a tool to facilitate a democracy? And I think that we also have to start having a discussion about what is technology and start thinking about how we can have a healthy relationship to technology. And I'm pointing to the fact that now that our society has been heavily relied on the use of technology. And for instance, that young child, at age maybe 3 or 6, they are put behind the iPad. And that technologies like iPad, iPhone, all of those gadgets are replaced as or substitute of the babysitters. In my generation, for instance, my mother parents who were working, both parents working, that probably they didn't have time to spend time with their children, so that they have to rely on TV. And now the technologies are replacing that, right? So the question that I think we need to ask ourselves is that, is it healthy for little kids to spend hours and hours behind the screens, and that before they even form their authentic relationship to the natural world, authentic relationship to another human being? Is it healthy for them to be placed behind the screens and then, majority of their time that they spend is to interact with the machine? So we really, I think it's important for us to really step back and start having a dialogue about what is technology and how we can use technology as a tool, and what kind of a tool it is and how it could serve for human interest rather than being used by it. And I see the dangerous trend already that our civilization is moving toward, which is, in many ways, I think our life itself has been taken over by technology. And nowadays, all aspects of our life have been uploaded on the internet, our data and personal information and everything. So it's important for us to start educating us about how we can use technology and what is the limit of technology.
John, what is your assessment of the current state of democracy in the United States?
One of the things I tell students in classes, they think the system in the United States is democracy. The first thing to understand is that the system in the United States is capitalism. We are told it's democracy, so they've been brought up to think that they live in a society where the system is democracy. And they have to understand that capitalism and democracy are in large part opposed to each other, and democracy is receding. What we call democracy in the United States is something that's completely redefined from what democracy meant originally and meant over millennia, really. What we call democracy in the United States it basically goes back to Joseph Schumpeter's Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy in 1942. He says, he asked the question is, what is democracy? And he said, democracy is what exists in the United States. So what exists in the United States? In the United States, he said, political entrepreneurs who compete for votes like money, actually using money to compete for the votes every 2 or 4 years. And people go out and vote for them, and then the political entrepreneurs basically, once they're elected, they run things without any concern for the population. That's what democracy is. It's a market system of democracy, and that's what democracy has become. But of course, that doesn't have anything to do with equality. It doesn't have anything to do with the population actually being able to control and participate, have say over their society. We've lost so much of that. So one of the things I try to emphasize is, look, the system isn't democracy, but you have to be prepared to fight for that. That's something that's been lost. That's something we have to struggle for. And I believe that most people believe in equality. Most people in our society, they believe in equality. And however much the ideology tries to justify inequality, most people have a strong belief in their gut in equality and democracy. I don't think these are things that have to be justified, because what they recognize is that all human beings are fundamentally equal in their rights, in their lives, and really what they can do, their potential. For the most part, we're equal. We can only have a community. We can only prosper as a society as a whole if we operate on that principle. Now there's this notion of Adam's fallacy, which is named after Adam Smith. We can have a better society by everybody pursuing their own self-interest and greed. As Noam Chomsky once said, well, that might work in a little society, but it certainly doesn't work on a global level, where we have a situation now where 10% of the population of the Earth account for almost all of the carbon emissions that are destroying the population, where you have this enormous discrepancies that are really the cause of all of our economic and ecological problems.
Going back to David, for all this talk of democracy, what's your take on two-party politics in the United States?
There will be no transformation of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is the other side of the coin, which the Republicans represent, the opposite. But it's just the same. They are the capitalist parties that have vested interest in the status quo. We need to change course. We can't rely on them. We need to lead And when we lead effectively and when we build power effectively in the workplace and in the communities, the politicians will follow. I take the leadership that was shown in recent years by Sarah Nelson of the flight attendants to be very inspiring. She's been traveling the country talking about the need to reinvigorate the labor movement. Frankly, I'm impressed. There's other great leaders out there too at high levels, such as Mark Diamondstein of the Postal Workers Union. There's radical and militant and left-leaning locals in every corner of this country. So I believe that that movement has started. I know that we will prevail in the end because history demands that we make these changes. We can't keep doing the same thing we've done year in, year out and fail and think that somehow the outcome's going to be different down the road. We're at a crossroads right now. COVID has unveiled many of the contradictions of our society. And I am wildly optimistic that the type of change we're talking about here is happening, and maybe not as fast as I like, but is happening, can happen, and will win in the end.
Jose, if we want to strive for a truly democratic society that's economically and socially just, that's humane and serves the planet as well, what are a few messages that might inspire awareness and participation?
The question of how to frame a message that resonates with the heartfelt needs of working people is fundamental. So if we talk about things like the need to raise the living wage in this country, right? How about the question of universal childcare? So these are the things that I suspect would resonate deeply with people, not the big, lofty goals and philosophical discussions of changing economic systems. Democracy has to be a frame in the context of the ability to be able to adopt the kinds of economic policies that would make our lives better. You need democratic rights in order to elect people that can then go to work and make sure that they enact legislation that would make it possible to increase the minimum wage to something that becomes a livable or a living wage, right? Or addressing the question of healthcare and healthcare justice. And so when it's talked about in those terms, people can see the connection, can see that it makes sense for them not only to go to vote, but actually enlist their neighbors and their relatives and their neighbors' relatives to actually participate in this thing called democracy, because it's a participatory democracy and it remains an experiment. It's an imperfect democracy, right? There are things that need fundamental change and transformation, but you got to bring it down to the basic question of how is it that we can use our right to cast a ballot, to vote, to improve the economy and to improve our lives and to be able to achieve a higher level of civilization, which is really what this is about. Democracy is about achieving a higher level of civilization, as I see it.
Mark, the same question for you. What's at stake and what can inspire awareness and participation?
I think the stakes are very, very high. For example, in the UK, I think there's a very real prospect that if more people don't understand how high the stakes are, we could, in effect, be well on our way to becoming the world's first formally developed country. If people are aware of how high the stakes are, then I think there are things that we need to do to fix the problem. The first is to have fact-based policy. So in the UK, for example, we've had one dominant policy for more than a decade now, which has been austerity, which is based on a series of myths about the way the economy runs and the state of government finances. And it's been enormously disruptive. It has eaten away at the fabric of society in many, many ways. So we've had a big increase in poverty. Our public schools are not what we call public schools, but publicly funded schools are struggling. They're underfunded. Our National Health Service has been underfunded for 10 years, and that's beginning to struggle as a result. So many, many aspects of the social contract of what we thought it meant to live in a civilized country have been not completely unwound, but significantly weakened by the simple expedient of underfunding them. So austerity is very, very dangerous policy, which has been justified entirely on the basis of myths. So although you would think it sounds such an obvious thing that it's not worth saying, fact-based policy is vital. It's absolutely fundamental to good policy making and to the first objective, which is to govern on behalf of the 99%. The second thing is we need to clean up capitalism, because there's no question that the profit motive is an enormously powerful force in society, but it's not a force, despite what we were probably all told at our mother's knee, it's not a force which always acts for the greater good. In fact, one of the easiest ways for a company to drive up its profits is to externalize its costs. So if I'm running a business and I can get the rest of society to pay some of my costs, my profit will go up. Similarly, if I avoid taxes, I might be taking all sorts of benefits that have been effectively provided for me by taxes, but I'm not contributing to that. That's not good for society. And if I pollute the environment, of course, that might be much cheaper than running a clean business, a carbon neutral business that doesn't pollute at all. So it's good for my bottom line, but as we've seen very clearly, it's disastrous for the world as a whole. So while businesses can notionally, and according to the way that the accounts are defined, while they can boost their profit by externalizing their costs, they will do that. Most of them will succumb to that pressure and effectively behave badly while they're permitted to do so. We need to change the way that company performance is measured and managed to make the profit motive into a force for good, which at the moment it isn't. So those would be, if I had a magic wand, those would be the things that I would want to see happen quickly.
Andy, what are the essential themes that you would raise to reach people and get them involved?
I think that people realize that this competitive idea of an unfettered capitalism, a capitalism is destroying people's livelihoods and destroying job security and messing up the planet, is pretty doomed. And so is there anything that we can do about it? I do think that the only real thing that we can do about it is to see that we needed some form of government that can care about people. We don't need cults of personality. We need governments that can think progressively, that understand that during pandemics, borders are important, but not building walls that are keeping people out. They're having dialogues with other countries that see things happening within their own territories as being problematic. And actually, by having dialogues between countries and having some form of cooperation rather than competition, we can begin to think that life is possible. The competition isn't what it's about, that actually human beings are cooperative. We do need each other. And with certain forms of cooperation, can retain a certain kinds of dignity. And we can maybe just try and reclaim the nature of the public realm, that the public sector has done some incredible things that were done under the New Deal and the post-war period, and some of the ways in which people's lives were enriched. That it has to be a transformation that goes on within people's mentalities. One of the ways we can do that is that we don't forget who we were, and that we're a species that functions as a collectivity, and we work best when we work together. If we forget that, then we forget some kind of important messages about that neoliberalism is a relatively new phenomenon, that people haven't always organized themselves like this, that it's been one solution that if it were anything else, it would be denied because factually it hasn't proven fit for purpose. It hasn't delivered what it said it would deliver. It's a failure empirically as well as ideologically, and as a basis of an idea how to organize people's lives. So it's a question of then how can important deeper messages be transmitted to people that aren't reducing things to sound bites, but we need some patience, we need some tolerance, we need some cooperation, we need some dignity, we need some compassion towards other people. And it's always out there. It's out there in society. And certainly if you travel around, you see it all the time. But I just think that some of the bigger forces in people's lives kind of get in the way and make it difficult to enact those kinds of things.
And the same question to you, John. What are essential messages to share with people?
So we have to believe in democracy, and we have to connect democracy to equality once again. We have to connect notions of justice to equality. Equality is the basis of any kind of conception of social justice. And adopting that, we then recognize that We have to unify populations representing different identities and needs into a bigger movement, into a great movement that emphasizes commonalities, equality, justice. We have to recognize this isn't just a moral issue anymore. We have to transform our entire production and consumption systems. We have to now follow low energy paths. There are all sorts of things we have to do. Basically, we have to carry out a revolution, not revolution in the sense of blood. And although repression may enter in if we try to save the planet for humanity, but a revolution in the sense that we really have to transform our social systems fundamentally, because this system of inequality and accumulation and growth based on greed and self-interest and the power of the 0.1% and the rule of corporations, none of this is going to work in the future. There will not be a future for even the younger population existing today, and certainly not for our grandchildren if we don't transform the social system. But to do that, we need more democracy or equality. We have to recognize that we have to fight for economic, environmental justice and for the earth. And we have to expand our sense of community and say goodbye to a society based on greed and self-interest and inequality and centralized power. I don't know if we'll win, but I do know, this is what I tell my students when they say, well, I'm just one person, I can't do anything, or how do we know? What we know is that hundreds of millions, probably billions of people are going to be engaged in this struggle over the future of humanity over the next decade or two, and calling for greater democracy and attempting to save the earth and fighting this wretched system, which is now so destructive. However, much it might have done for the world in the past, it's now turned into a completely destructive system. And the question is whether you join the struggle or not. And that's the only question you really should be concerned with. We don't know whether we'll be able to turn these things around, but we do know that human beings will struggle, probably on a level greater than humanity has ever seen. And there's something in being part of that. That's going to be the definition of being human in our century.
What's your take on engaging people, David?
Well, look, if you work 40 hours a week, if you do what you're supposed to do, you should not have to worry about paying the bills. You should not have to worry about medical bills. You should not have to worry about foreclosures on your home or a rent eviction. You should not have to worry about having to take time off work to take care of a family member. We need to fight for the type of society that supports those basic social benefits for all working class people. And we have to do it in a way that's green, that's sustainable, and takes into account the dire situation our environment is in. But again, these changes aren't going to happen because a couple good people in Washington, Mr. Smith aside, decide that they're the right thing to do. They're going to happen when millions of people are in the street. They're going to happen when there's workplace actions going on all across this country. And as we fight and as we win, more folks will come and join organized labor, right?
Nancy, what's vital for us to share to inspire people to get involved and bring about a more beneficial world?
I believe that there are a lot of people who are already in motion, involved in activism, in political organizing, and as I said before, some on a very exclusionary, racist, authoritarian track, others on a much better track. So I don't think we need to convince people to become active and to participate. I think what I see my job as doing is to help give people a map of the larger social structure, a map on which they could locate themselves, see how what they're doing is entangled with and could synergize in a productive way with what other people are doing. People whose immediate problems are different and might seem at first sight to be disconnected, but according to the picture I'm creating, are actually all connected in the sense of all traceable to the one and the same social system I've been describing. And I think that the more people who understand themselves in that way, the greater our chances are of building a broad coalition of social forces. In other words, it's not a question of asking Black Lives Matter activists to put that on the back burner and focus on climate change or vice versa. But rather, these things are connected in complicated ways. And if people, or Me Too, or whatever else it is, people who are active in one or another of these domains, if they could come to see themselves as having a common enemy, sharing a systemic, a structural system that needs to be transformed, then I think you get the possibility to rise to the occasion. Again, what I said before is that this is not a moment to be looking for piecemeal reformism, tinkering here and there. The situation is too dire. There isn't time, especially given the climate change issue. And you can't make change that's significant to halt the authoritarian forces. I mean, part of what has to be done is that the forces for democracy, for justice, for a livable planet, these forces have to somehow win away some segment of those who are currently supporting the very bad alternatives. We can't simply write them all off as, what was Hillary Clinton's word, deplorables, completely irredeemable. Some of them are, but I would say probably not the majority. And under different circumstances, if given a different option, I can't make a prediction that things will come out well, but I do know that if we don't try that, we ensure the worst. So I think that the times, the crisis creates the engagement. The question is how to shape it, how to direct it, how to enlighten it, so that people on the ground can begin to see what they're doing as a strand, a contributing strand to a larger shared project that can tackle the deep structural questions.
Nozomi, the final words are yours.
I think it's important for us to be more critical about certain narratives that come out from mainstream media or our political system, and one of which is the racism or equality, fairness, and the narratives to combat climate change, etc., etc. And the reason why I say that we need to be critical of these narratives themselves is that our political system, mainly electoral politics, is just set up by the ruling elite to control the populace. I don't see that as the democratic system at all. That its goal is to control people. They use electoral politics and they use mainstream media to basically divide citizens into parties based on identity politics. We all have our self-interest and we identify ourselves with race, gender, class, etc., etc. And then so the ruling elite basically use these narratives. So targeting certain communities, for instance. And of course, the racism is a huge issue. There's no question about it. So that people who are experiencing racism, that's part of their life, that ruling elite target our trauma, our wound, our vulnerabilities, and the sense of oppression and all those things to manipulate our emotions, to control people. And I think at the first glance, I don't think people can see through this. And then we get emotionally caught up with it, emotionally deeply engaged with these narratives. And then we were brought to the electoral political arena to fight against the opponents, right? So that we see this in the case of the United States, then we see this two-party duopoly. I think that's a way for oligarchic class, basically people who actually run the government. They use the tactics of divide and conquer to continue to keep people be enslaved to this system. So that as long as this political system functions, we would never be able to attain democracy because we are constantly kept away from creating our own power and connecting with our fellow citizens and to build a real, democratic systems. For me, it's be critical of narratives, any narratives that come our way, because these narratives, especially the narratives that became very popular, narratives that became very dominant, these narratives are created by people who don't have our best interest. We have to find a way to not just succumb to this tactics of divide and conquer. So whenever we start seeing opponent, enemies, the things to fight against, then I think it's important for us to go deep inside and ask questions about who these enemies are. And when emotions stay up within ourselves that compel us to act, that we should be mindful, we should examine these emotions. What are these emotions that are rising within that make me to act in a certain way? Perhaps not our own emotions. I mean, if that makes sense. Because the ruling elite has been manipulating our emotions, and they know how to manipulate our perception and emotions. They understand our vulnerabilities. They know how to manipulate them. I think the message I give to your audience perhaps is be critical of any narratives and then find a way to consciously engage with our own emotions and stay present with ourselves and work on internal processes before we actually get out and start to do something.
Thank you all so much for joining us for 2 Minutes to Midnight. People get ready. And a huge thanks to our guests, Nancy Fraser, Andy Merrifield, David Van Duzen, Mark E. Thomas, John Bellamy Foster, Jose La Luz, and Nozomi Hayase. You can find the current schedule of Catalista podcasts and sign up for our weekly email at catalista.net. If you enjoyed 2 Minutes to Midnight, please add, comment, and like us on your favorite podcast platform. 2 Minutes to Midnight was edited by Tim Darden, Chris Porro, Joshua Cash, Christina Hiramoto, and Andrei Shamanov. The mix is by Chris Porro. Sound design is by Darren Chorley. Our music is composed by John Askew. The executive producers are Chicky Munch and Benny Bunny Munch, with assistance from Ed Goldberg and Gerald Gerbil. 2 Minutes to Midnight, People Get Ready is proud to partner with Local Futures, a non-profit organization that's a pioneer in the worldwide localization movement. Visit them at localfutures.org. This is Henry Coleman signing off from the studios at Catalista Centrale. See you next time.